Hello everyone. Lovely to be here at the conference. It's been absolutely fantastic so far. Really enjoyed it, and absolutely delighted to give a presentation now, which I hope will work. See what happens. Hang on. There we go. Yeah, so this is my presentation. I'm going to talk about nature recovery, past, present and future. I very often start with a little introductory slide saying what I'm going to talk about, but actually I don't need to, because I'm going to talk about what it says on the very title of the scheme. So I'm here as Chief Exec of Tees Valley Wildlife Trust, but also as the Chair of the Natural Environment Working Group of the Nature Partnership. But what I'm actually going to say is a little bit more, I guess, of a personal perspective, but hopefully it brings those things together. So before I really kick into the sort of nature recovery stuff, I just wanted to answer the question that the conference has actually presented to us. What can nature do for us? And we've heard the fabulous points of view from the social, the economic, the personal benefits of nature. But from nature itself, what nature can do for us is massive. Not just, the whole ecosystem, but quite specifically as well. These things are all delivered for us by the smallest bits of nature, the bugs, the creepy crawlies, the insects. And without these, we would all be dead. So that's what nature does for us. That's the absolute bottom line. It keeps us alive. It keeps the planet working. And the really scary thing, and the reason this links back into nature recovery strategies, is that insects, and particularly flying insects, seem to be just disappearing from our natural environment at an alarming rate. And if we don't do something about this, I think we're all in trouble. So nature recovery past. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Wildlife Trusts, the organisation I work for, started out as an organisation called the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves. And really that's where nature recovery began, I guess. And the first nature reserves were sort of the collection of the sort of really interesting bits of rare habitat, or the places where rare species lived. People were able to gather those together and protect them as little pots of nature distributed around the country. And when the Tees Valley Wildlife Trust started, we weren't working in an area where we had very much really good wildlife. So we had to make our own. This is a view of the centre of the Tees conurbation. You can see the A19 flyover there and the River Tees. And this was taken in 1987. You can see it was very industrial. There were rolling mills at the centre of Stockton. And that bit of the river there was pretty much dead. There wasn't much living in it at all. In fact, a trawl by the National Rivers Authority found just one dead flounder along that stretch, nothing else. And the little boat you can see there in the middle was collecting sewage sludge from the treatment works, and it would mix that with some waste from ICI's sulfuric acid works, and then it would take it out and dump it in the North Sea. There wasn't much nature to protect, but there was a hell of a lot of nature to recover. And that little piece of ground right in the centre, the sort of bare bit of grassland with a wet bit behind, was the basis for one of the Trust's nature reserves that now looks like that. That's nature recovery, that piece of land that we re-wetted, that we planted with reeds, planted with some shrubs and trees and wildflowers, put some footpaths in and got people back into. That was nature recovery in action. And that site went from being a bare bit of land owned by what was the British Steel Corporation into a nature reserve owned by the Wildlife Trust, and then was designated last year as a special protection area for wild birds of international importance for the species of wild birds that it protects. So that was nature recovery. We thought, well, we're quite good at this. And it really worked for some species. Species like the otter, which came back into the area as a result of improvements to our rivers, bringing life back into stretches of the River Tees, meant that there was food for species like the otter, and it came back in and was first seen on Teesside in 2004 at Portrack Marsh. The first photograph, the first real evidence of otters returning to the river were right there at the centre of the conurbation. And the barn owl in 1987 was virtually extinct from the Tees Valley. There were virtually none. But with the result of nature reserves and very specific targeted action, we were able to recover populations of species like the barn owl quite significantly. So yeah, we're doing all right, aren't we, in terms of nature recovery? But then there are two more species that, when I think of the change to these species, it's gone the other way. So here we've got the swift and the cuckoo. And the interesting thing with these is they both require flying insects as their food source. Swifts feed on the wing and eat vast numbers of flying insects, and their numbers have been steadily declining. I used to see swifts every day. I used to see swift from my back garden. In the area of just to the west of Stockton where I live, there were pairs of swifts nesting not very far away, and this year they're not there, and I haven't seen any. I don't think I've only seen one pair of swifts in the area this year. And the cuckoo, there were two cuckoos near to where I lived. I could hear them calling from one end of the village or the other end of the village. They don't eat flying insects, but they eat the young of flying insects, so they eat hairy caterpillars. But cuckoos, again, I haven't heard one this year. They're disappearing. And I think the really worrying thing is that although these things are disappearing, they're a real symptom of something that's gone wrong in our natural environment. A loss that's occurring and that isn't compensated for by the nature reserves we've created. We need a wider recovery of nature, a nature recovery network in order to set us back on track. This is something that's been picked up by the wildlife trusts, and we've set out a plan. We've said that we think that around 30% of land ought to be benefiting wildlife in order for nature to recover, and we need that to be in place by 2030. I've put up our other two targets there as well, because we can't do this in isolation, as we heard earlier. We need to connect people with nature, and we need people to take action for nature, because it can't be down to a scattering small proportion of the population that is putting nature back. We need a lot more people to be working with us to make a sort of critical mass of action for nature's recovery. And then also the climate crisis, because we can't ignore the fact that our climate has changed and will have a significant impact on the way we need to think about nature, and also the way we need to think about restoring nature. So we can't just look at nature in isolation. We have to look at the people side, and we have to look at the climate side if we want to do something effective about this. So I had a look and I thought, can we get 30% of land back to nature by 2030? What's our starting point? And if our starting point is the land that's already protected or designated as sites of special scientific interest, as local wildlife sites, or as all the nature reserves owned by the Wildlife Trust and RSPB, the Woodland Trust, the National Trust, the land under agricultural environmental schemes like farm stewardship, and then all the local authority country parks and local nature reserves. Across the Tees Valley, that just makes up 11.4% of our area. We've got a significant challenge ahead of us. And if we look at that at a local level as well, even more local level, perhaps Redcar and Cleveland has slightly less of a challenge. 13.6% of the natural environment there is given to nature, and the rest is not. But in Middlesbrough, it's tiny. It's 3.1%. It's an urban area. There are a lot of people living there. This both sets out the nature and the scale of the challenge we have, but also makes you start to think about perhaps there are some different approaches we could take. So when I was thinking about this stage of my presentation, I thought, well, that's great. I can talk about nature recovery in the past. and nature recovery in the present, but how do I talk about nature recovery in the future? How do I illustrate that? So I was riding to work on my bike on Wednesday morning thinking, how on earth am I going to do this? And I came across this scene. And yeah, okay, it's just outside the Tees Valley. This is at Newby. It's only a few hundred yards from the Middlesbrough boundary. But this is nature recovery in action. This is a village green. And as you can see by that goalpost in the background, this year they've decided to let nature recover here. And it's not massively diverse, is it? It's not rare species, but it's certainly food for insects and food for flying insects. And it's brilliant habitat. And it's also beautiful, unless I guess you're a football player, in which case your goalposts are somewhat isolated now. Although, having said that, I did cycle around the corner and I found another small football pitch around there, which was being managed properly for footballers anyway. Another opportunity that's starting to come together are just things like putting ponds back into the landscape. Again, fairly simple features, but absolutely brilliant for nature's recovery for flying insects and for a whole variety of wildlife. And this is part of a scheme that Natural England are running. And it's specifically aimed at great crested newts. And it's looking at the way in the past we used to safeguard every single great crested newt that came in the way of development. And what Natural England have done have worked out a way of changing that. And instead of safeguarding individual newts, they've got development money that used to go into that process. And they said, let's use that to put loads and loads of ponds back into the landscape. And last year they put in 1,000 ponds across the country. And this year they're hoping to put in even more, and they're starting to work with us in the Tees Valley. And this gives us a little foothold into that farmed landscape, a way we can talk to farmers and put some natural environment back into the parts of the landscape which have suffered most from depletion of nature. And then the other thing is everyone's talking about, and that's tree planting, and we can put some trees back into the landscape. Although it's really not that easy when you come down to it, because sometimes it's you end up putting trees in the wrong place. You put trees where they're already meadows or in the sort of marginal places on the edge of towns, which actually turn out to be good habitat for other things. So we've got to think about putting trees back into the landscape, but we can also think, I think, in two other ways. We've got to think about how we subsidise those landowners for the loss of income that they would have had from farming that land, perhaps for the next 30 years. So we've got to make sure that the economic systems are there to support that level of tree planting in our ambition. But perhaps even in the immediate and the short term, we can think about putting hedgerows back into the landscape and enriching and strengthening hedgerow networks, because these don't necessarily get in the way of farming activities. They allow us to continue with some of our food production, but they could really enrich the margins of farmland and actually increase the sort of network of habitat that is available for nature across the piece. And I hope with that sort of breadth of activity and the increasing push for this activity, with more and more people engaged and more opportunities being seen, perhaps just to do small things rather than that sort of intensity of nature recovery that we've done in nature reserves in the past, but actually look at it on a perhaps less intense scale, but just a bit more relaxed and allowing things to grow, allowing things to get a bit wilder. We can actually bring back swifts back into our blue-green networks. And this lovely picture of the blue natural environment is my clever segue into our next speaker. Thank you.